guys, so today in honor of non-fiction November I thought I would give you guys some non-fiction recommendations. Although these are some of my favourite non-fiction books, rather than just give you like random non-fiction favourites that I enjoyed, I thought I would base them around different types of books, because the cool thing about non-fiction that I feel is the same with like classics as well, there's kind of non-fiction for everyone because it's such a broad genre. There are kind of other genres within non-fiction, the same as there are like other genres within classics, and I think that because of that, every type of reader, so like no matter what you like reading, there will be some kind of non-fiction that you might enjoy. Some of these recommendations might help you find some non-fiction to read if that's something you're wanting to get into but you don't really know where to start. So the first recommendations that I'm going to give you are ones that if you like reading young adult fiction, YA, I think you'll like some of these non-fiction reads because they have a very similar feel for whatever reason. So the first one is one that I feel like most people probably have read anyway, and that's The Diary of Anne Frank by Anne Frank, a teenage girl who was a Holocaust victim. So she was living in Germany at the time of World War II, and her family, because they were Jewish, were persecuted and went into hiding. They lived in like an annex for quite a long period of time before they eventually got caught and got sent to concentration camps. So Anne kept a diary throughout that time, and after she passed away, after the war ended and everything, I think it was her father who approved for it to be published, and it's a really, really important piece of literature from history, obviously, because it kind of highlights the war and that historical period from like a different perspective. Because it's the diary of a teenage girl, it's something that I feel young people can relate to, or just people who like reading YA. It is really, really sad, but I think a really important book. The second one is one that's kind of a little bit less serious, a little bit more fun. It's called Rapture Practice by Aaron Hartzler. Aaron Hartzler is also a YA author. He wrote What We Saw, which is a really good YA book. This book is his autobiography about his own childhood and his own youth. So it follows from when he was a kid up until he's about, I think, like 20 or so, and most of it is focused on his life during high school. And the really cool thing about this book is that it's true, like it's his own autobiography, but it kind of reads to me like an extended like YA contemporary, because it's just dealing with all of the things he went through in high school and his like family life and his social life and all that kind of thing. Sometimes autobiographies can be really dry. I don't like the ones that are like random, like just little bits, like little essays on different topics. I don't like those ones. I like ones like this that have like a story to them. Aaron also had a very strict Christian upbringing, which is really interesting to me as well, and he also is gay, but it's not something he especially deals with in this book, I feel, because it was something he kind of came to terms with a little bit later in his life, but it's something that definitely was maybe in the back of his mind a little bit. So it deals with some different issues, and I just find this book really entertaining, fun autobiography to read. The final one that I would recommend based on if you like to read YA is Republic by Plato. This is like classical non-fiction kind of. Plato was a philosopher, and this particular text was written in around 380 BCE, I think. So it's very, very old, and he basically outlines his view for like how he would run the world if it was his choice, and how he thinks it would be most efficient and most effective for all of humanity. It's really, really interesting, and the reason I say people who like YA might like this is, especially if you like dystopian fiction, it's really, really interesting because I feel like this particular work has inspired a lot of dystopian fiction. One of the main ideas behind his Republic is that he would separate children from their parents when they were little so that they would all grow up like equal, and then based on their natural talents and attributes and things like that, they would separate them into people who would be leaders, people who would be like army, military, defense type people, and then everyone else like merchants and just general civilians. But he thought that people wouldn't really like being divided up by the leaders, so he developed this idea where there would be this big conspiracy, like secret, that all of the leaders would know but no one else would know, that God puts different types of blood into different people. So the leaders have gold blood, the military people have silver blood, and everyone else has bronze blood, and the leaders are the only ones who know what type of blood you have, and that's why you get divided into these different categories. So I think that's a really interesting concept, and I haven't read Red Queen, that YA series, but it sounds very similar to that to me, because I think in Red Queen they have like silver bloods and red bloods, and this just is a very similar concept. So I think if you like dystopian fiction and those political kind of ideas, I think you would really enjoy this one. Another category that I'm only going to go over very briefly because I only have one recommendation for this one, but basically if you like music, if you are someone who is really into bands and musicians and artists and you want to know more about them, my favorite biography along those lines is the biography of Kurt Cobain, called Heavier Than Heaven by Charles R. Cross. This is a fantastic biography. I think Charles Cross is a great writer. The whole thing, it just reads really nicely. It's absolutely fascinating. He has gotten a lot of great interviews with different people that knew Kurt. It's just fascinating. I've read this book multiple times. My dad has also read it multiple times as well, and I think if you are interested in Nirvana or grunge or anything like that, I think you will really enjoy this book. My next category for recommending non-fiction is people who like books that are about mental health awareness, anything like depression, anxiety related, anything like that. I think you'll find these two books really good. The first one is Madness Made Me by Mary O'Hagan. Mary O'Hagan is a New Zealand author, and she's someone that I saw speak at the Auckland Writers Festival a couple years ago, and she just sounded so fascinating that I bought her book, and I'm so glad that I did because it really changed my perspective about mental health and what kind of institutions and things we have to deal with mental health issues, and how perhaps we could do better in that regard. Mary is someone that throughout a lot of her life dealt with mental health issues herself. She also in parts compares her own like personal diaries that she kept at that point to notes from psychiatrists and psychologists and things that she talked to, and it's just very interesting, like the disconnect between how she perceived like her situation, how she was feeling, to how a psychologist was perceiving how she was feeling. It's just completely fascinating. So a lot of it is just a memoir of her life, but Mary ended up coming through all of that, working her way through it, and she ended up as the Mental Health Commissioner for New Zealand, which means she's done some work with the United Nations and things like that on mental health and how we can deal with it. And I just think she's an amazing woman, and it's just interesting to hear from someone who has seen both sides of it. They have had experiences and difficulties themselves with their own mental health, but have also worked with other people and worked within these institutions. I just think it's so fascinating. The other one that I would recommend to do with mental health is Brain on Fire by Susanna Cahalan. This book is amazing. Susanna Cahalan is a journalist. She was a journalist before any of this happened to her. This is her own little memoir as well. So it's fantastically written because she was a writer before any of this happened anyway, so it's a really, really great read. Susanna got really, really sick. No one could figure out why. She pretty much completely lost it mentally and ended up in hospitals and everything, and no one could really figure out what was wrong with her, and you know, whether she just had a complete mental like breakdown or whether there was something else going on. So the whole book is kind of just going over that experience. She doesn't remember a lot of it herself, but it's, you know, through interviews with doctors and with her family and everything. It's just about them figuring out what was actually going on, and it's a big like kind of suspenseful mystery type of thing, like a bit of a medical mystery that is quite intense. I think if you like House, the TV show with Hugh Laurie, I think you'll really like this book. It has a similar kind of vibe to it. It's super interesting, and I think it's kind of a little bit scary at the same time because it makes you realize that these things happen to people and it's completely terrifying. I have another couple that are kind of have a little bit to do with mental health but not entirely. The first one is Sophie's Legacy by Leslie Elliott. Leslie Elliott is Sophie's mother. Sophie was a young woman living in Dunedin, I think, in New Zealand, and she was murdered by her ex-boyfriend sort of like right after she graduated from university, so she was very young, and this is Leslie's story. She's basically trying to open up conversations about warning signs in relationships and that kind of thing. It deals a little bit, this is the mental health aspect that I was talking about, it deals a little bit with narcissism, like as a disorder, because the killer they think was a narcissist. It also deals with the criminal justice system, particularly in New Zealand at the time. This was written about 8 years or so ago, I think. So things might have changed since then, but it really delves into what experiencing something like this is like for the victim's family, because they don't get a whole lot of support through the justice system. It's an incredibly sad book, obviously, because you're dealing with a mother who has lost a child in a really horrific sort of circumstance. I'm glad that Leslie wrote this because I think it's one of those things where it's an issue that we need to talk about more than we do. The other one that's somewhat to do with mental health is Civilianized by Michael Anthony. This is an autobiography by a young veteran who returned from war back to America and has to deal with learning to live as like a normal citizen again, trying to be like a normal person when no one really understands what he's been through. And yeah, so in that way it kind of focuses on PTSD and dealing with that a little bit, as well as veteran suicide, which is a really big issue. There are sort of lighthearted moments in this, but it's very sad as well. But I think another really important one that definitely probably doesn't get touched on enough. So if that's something you're interested in, I highly recommend this one. It's a really fantastically well written autobiography as well. The last two that I want to talk about are, if you like reading classics, I think you might like these. This one is Of Street Pie Men by Henry Mayhew. This is basically little observations written in the Victorian era. So Henry, I think he wrote for like newspapers or something like that. He would just write little observations or little interviews of ordinary people in London at the time. The Victorian era, like the 1800s, is a really fascinating period to me, and you come across a lot of non-fiction about main historical events that happened and Queen Victoria and things like that, but you don't get a whole lot of non-fiction about ordinary people. So I love that Henry Mayhew wrote this. It's a really interesting little collection. There's a few different pieces in here. One of them is about the pie men, just men who sold pies on the street. There's one about a balloon ride, because ballooning was kind of a thing, and there's an interview with some different women, and I just love this little book. The other one is also from the Victorian period. It's just a period that I really like, and this is A Hippo Banquet by Mary Kingsley. Mary Kingsley was a fascinating woman. She was a female explorer, which was somewhat unusual, I think, at the time. She would go to Africa and observe animals and just write down all of her observations. This is some of her little pieces that she wrote. If you like animals and wildlife and anything like that, I think you'll really like this, as well as if you just want to read about a really inspiring, awesome woman. If you've read any of these, let me know that in the comments down below. Let me know your thoughts on them, or if any of them sound awesome to you. And if there's any non-fiction books that you love that you'd like to recommend to me, make sure you leave them in the comments too. And I will see you guys with another video in a couple days. Bye.